to everyone. Welcome to Institute of Global Professionals, the largest online leading learning professional development institute from all over the world, global accredited and internationally recognized. I think lots of participants, our live learner, are waiting for tonight's program, which is 204. Yes, 204 international webinar. So I'm not professional host, so no more in my voice. That's my point. I'm going to directly welcoming our first speaker, Sir Clarence D. Hakuman. He is on the stage right now. Hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
How are you, sir?
I'm good, sir.
Sir, I'd like to request to you that please introduce yourself because you have a very nice voice.
Oh, thank you, sir.
So we can see you also. Yes. With the voice, you have a good face also.
Oh, thank you, sir.
So the stage is yours now.
Ah, Good day, everyone. I am Clarence Lacruz Sacuman from the Philippines. Uh, Currently, I am a head teacher 3 of MAPE department at San Guillermo National High School here in San Marcelino, Zambales. I finished my master's degree at Casillejos, Zambales, and my doctor's degree at Pampanga. For tonight's webinar entitled Disaster Preparedness and Climate Change Adaptation, I will be the first speaker to be followed by my colleague, Sir Emmanuel Demasig. So to start with, let me share with you my PowerPoint. Okay. So first, we have to unlock some terminologies about disaster risk reduction management and climate change. So first, let us have the objectives. Present the DRRM and CC agreed definitions according to the Republic Act. Actually, this Republic Act is uh, one of our reference. Republic Act 10121 Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, the 2009 UNISDR Terminology on Disaster Risk Reduction, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the IPCC, and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change UNFCCC. Gain understanding and right application of the DRRM and CC related terminologies. And lastly, be able to formulate a DRRM CCAM plan for the respective schools based on their understanding of the DRRM and CC concepts and terminologies. Okay, let's start with the word hazard. It means a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. There is a potential slow onset, rapid onset, natural, or human induced. So let us take the first one, which is the natural hazards. Examples of natural hazards caused by tropical cyclones, floods, storm surge, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, landslides, and drought. Next one, we have the human-induced hazards. Examples are fire, maritime accidents, aircraft crash, land accidents, industrial accidents, pollution, civil disturbance, terrorism, and armed conflict. to name a few. So next word we have disaster. So you can see it in the picture being presented. So the serious disruption of the functioning of society causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected people to cope using their own resources. The potential disaster losses in lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur to a particular community or a society over some specified future time period is called the disaster risk. Formula for disaster risk we have hazard times vulnerability over capacity. So later on, we're going to discuss other terms such as vulnerability. The characteristics and circumstances of community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard could arise from physical, social, economic, and environmental factors, is what we call vulnerability. Next, we have capacity. It is the combination of all the strengths, attributes, and resources available within a community, society, or organization that can be used to achieve agreed goals. Next one, we have prevention, the outright avoidance of adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. Sendai framework for DRR speaks of prevention as prevention of new risks. Later on, we're going to discuss the Sendai framework for DRR. Next one, we have the mitigation, the lessening or limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. The adverse impacts of hazards, in particular natural hazards, often cannot be prevented fully, but their scale or severity can be substantially lessened by various strategies and actions. Mitigation measures include engineering techniques and hazard resistant construction, as well as improve environmental and social policies and public awareness. Next one, we have preparedness, the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely imminent or current hazard events or conditions. Preparedness requires formal institutional, legal, and budgetary support and capacities. It aims to build capacities needed to efficiently manage all types of emergencies. This is an example taken from the News TV. Next, we have response, provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster in order to save lives, reduce health impacts, ensure public safety, and meet the basic subsistence needs of the people affected. Response is also immediate and short-term needs. Division between response stage and subsequent recovery stage is not clear-cut. Response actions such as the supply of temporary housing and water supplies may extend well into the recovery stage. Another example of a response. Next one, we have rehabilitation, measures that ensure the ability of affected communities or areas to restore their normal level of functioning by rebuilding livelihood and damaged infrastructures and increasing the community's organizational capacity. Actions taken in the aftermath of disaster to first assist victims to repair their dwellings. Second, to establish essential services. Third, revive key economic and social activities. Example of rehabilitation. Next one, we have reconstruction. Reconstruction is permanent measures to repair or replace damaged dwellings and infrastructure and to set the economy back on course. Build back better. That's reconstruction. Another example. Next one, we have recovery. The restoration and improvement were appropriate of facilities, livelihood, and living conditions of disaster affected communities, including efforts to reduce disaster risk factors. Applies Build Back Better principle. Next one. Disaster risk reduction or the DRR. The concept and practice of reducing disaster risk through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters, including through reduced exposure to hazards, lessened vulnerability of people and property, wise management of land and the environment, and improved preparedness for adverse events. As I've said a while ago, we're going to discuss Sendai framework for DRR later on. It speaks of DRR as reducing existing risks. Uh, this is a Tagalog or Filipino example or caricature or cartoon. Disaster risk management, the systematic process of using administrative directives, organizations, and operational skills and capacities to implement strategies, policies, and improve coping capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards and the possibility of disaster. DRM is DRR in action. Next one, we have resilience. The ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions. The ability of women and men to realize their rights and improve their well being despite shocks, stresses, and uncertainty came from Oxfam. The capacity of a system, community, or society potentially exposed to hazards to adapt by changing or resisting in order to reach and maintain acceptable levels of functioning and structure. It is also the capacity of a community to grow through disasters, according to World Vision International. Next one, we have climate change. Climate change, according to IPCC or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Change in the state of climate over time due to, first, natural processes, second, human activity. Now, according to UNFCCC or United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, change in the state of climate over time due to human activity either directly or indirectly. Human activities, example, activities that release greenhouse gases, also known as anthropogenic. Greenhouse gases. These are gaseous constituents of the atmosphere, both natural and anthropogenic, that absorb and emit radiation of thermal infrared radiation emitted by the Earth's surface, the atmosphere itself, and by clouds. It's according to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we have here carbon dioxide, methane molecule, water vapor, and nitrous oxide. Next one. So let us take a look at the picture. It says, what's wrong? So there is a dramatic increase of greenhouse gases emissions and concentration since pre-industrial times. So even before. So next, we have the IPCC 2007 conclusion. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level. That's according to WG1 IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. So next one. Okay, this is a global forest system model. Adaptation is adjustment in natural or human systems and in response to actual or expected stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits benefits opportunities. Adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. It refers to changes in processes, practices, and structures to moderate potential damages or to benefit from opportunities associated with climate change. So we have mitigation in climate change. An anthropogenic intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases, human intervention to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases by sources or enhance the removal from the atmosphere by sinks. A sink refers to forest, vegetation, or soils that can reabsorb carbon dioxide. Mitigation in DRRM is lessening the impacts of hazard. It is closer to the idea of adaptation in climate change. In climate change, mitigation is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Now we're through with the some of the terminologies. Now let us move on with the international and national foundations of DRRM in the education sector. So international and national legal frameworks, conventions, standards. So we have a framework here. DRRM in education. So we have United Nations conventions on the right of the child, core humanitarian standards in quality and accountability, INEE minimum standards in education, preparedness, response, recovery. We have Sendai framework for DRR, comprehensive school safety framework. We have the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management. We have Climate Change Act of 2009. We have Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act of or the Republic Act 10821. So we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, core rights related to the RRM. So let us have some of the rights of a child. The right to special protection for the child's physical, mental, and social development. The right to recreational activities and free education. The right to be among the first to receive relief in all circumstances. The right to protection against all forms of neglect, cruelty, and exploitation. We have the right to access safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We have the next one. We have core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability. We have DRRM was born from the humanitarian field. So here, uh, core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability was formulated last December 2014, developed by Group URD. URD stands for Urgent Rehabilitation Development, EHAP, International Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, and other humanitarian standards working to improve and harmonize the humanitarian standards. This is to support the continual call for coherent, single, harmonized, and easy to follow standards for organization, individual providing assistance. Core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability has 9 humanitarian commitments. So the first one is effective, timely, and appropriate humanitarian assistance. Second one, access to the humanitarian assistance they need at the right time. Third, access to humanitarian assistance they need. Humanitarian response strengthens local capacities and avoid negative effects. The fourth one, communication and participation and feedback. The fifth one, addressing grievance. The sixth one, coordination, complementarity, and partnership. Seventh, the monitoring, learning, and continuous improvement. Eight, staff capacity and support. The last one, resource management for intended purpose. We have the INEE minimum standards for education, preparedness, response, and recovery. INEE is a global open network of non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, donors, practitioners, researchers, and individuals from affected populations working together within a humanitarian and development framework to provide all persons with the right to quality and safe education in emergencies and post-crisis recovery situations. INEE minimum standards for education in emergency foundation standards. So these standards include coordination, community participation, and analysis. As you can see on the illustration, it is the part of the outside of the circle. Access, this standard should be applied across all domains to promote a holistic quality response. So we have access and learning environment. Standards in this domain focus on access to safe and relevant learning opportunities. They highlight critical linkages with other sectors such as health, water and sanitation, nutrition, and shelter that help to enhance security, safety, and physical, cognitive, and psychological well being. We have teaching and learning. These standards focus on critical elements that promote effective teaching and learning, including curricula, training, professional development and support, instruction and learning processes, and assessment of learning outcomes. The next one, we have teachers and other education personnel. Standards in this domain cover administration and management of human resources in the field of education. This includes recruitment and selection, conditions of service, and supervision and support. Last one, we have the education policy. Standards in this domain focus on policy formulation and enactment, planning, and implementation. Next one, we have the Sendai framework for DRR. Okay. There are 187 countries who attended the World Conference on DRR conducted last March 18, 2015 at Sendai, Japan, successor to the Yugo Framework for Action or the HFA. Sendai Framework for DRR adopted on March 18, 2015 during 3rd UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Miyagi, Japan. Continue the work carried out from the Yoga Framework for Action, calls for action for the next 15 years. The same Sendai Framework is the recognition of increasing effects and complexity of disasters. Sendai Framework for DRR, fueled by the desire to incorporate the identified gaps, lessons learned, and realizations gained during the course of the implementation of earlier framework of the HFA. Greater emphasis on disaster risk management through new understanding and interpretation rather of disaster risk and the need to avoid the creation of new risk. Specifically designed the expected outcome to achieve significant reduction in disaster risk, health, livelihood, infrastructure, and losses in life. The prevention of new and emerging risks and reduction are reducing existing risk. So, seven global targets. We have to reduce mortality, affected people, economic loss, damage to critical infrastructure, and disruption of basic services. We have to increase countries with national and local DRR strategies, international cooperation to developing countries, availability and access to multi hazard early warning systems, and disaster risk information and assessments. So, four priorities for action. So we have the Sendai framework has four main priorities. We have first, understanding disaster risk. It is about ensuring that the policies and practices in disaster risk reduction and management are results of clear and right understanding of vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards. Priority 2, strengthening disaster risk governance, a call for governments to have strong strategies in making sure that all policies, laws, planned existing activities, and budget allocation are being institutionalized to secure the efficient management of disaster risk. Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. This is to encourage not only governments but also the private sector to invest in disaster risk reduction to prevent any kind of losses. Priority 4, the last one, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. The importance of disaster preparedness, this is to enhance the response and build back better as aim of recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. What the Sendai framework says about education. So we have incorporation of disaster risk knowledge in formal and non-formal education, civic education, professional education, and training. Strengthen structural and non-structural disaster risk prevention and reduction in critical facilities, particularly schools and hospitals. Promote resilience of new and existing critical infrastructures, educational facilities, hospitals, etc. Ensure continuity of operations and planning and provision of basic services in post disaster, regular disaster preparedness, response, and recovery exercises, including evacuation drills, provide psychosocial support and mental health services for all people in need. So, comprehensive school safety framework. So, we have the three pillars. The CSS framework is tended to advance the goals of the Worldwide Initiative for Safe Schools and the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in the Education Sector and to promote school safety as a priority area of post 2015 framework for sustainable development, risk reduction, and resilience. Comprehensive school safety is addressed by education policy and practices aligned with disaster management at national, regional, district, and local school site levels rest on three pillars. So we have pillar one, safe learning facilities. Second pillar, school disaster management. And the last one, risk reduction and resilience education. So under the first pillar, it involves education authorities, planners, architects, engineers, builders, and school community members in safe site selection, design, construction, and maintenance. Includes structural and non-structural components. It also includes safe and continuous access to facilities. Example for this is the provision of temporary learning spaces or the TLS. Next one, we have the school disaster management established via national and sub-national education authorities and local school communities, including children and parents, working in collaboration with their disaster management counterparts at each jurisdiction in order to maintain safe learning environments and plan for educational continuity conforming to international standards. The last one, Pillar 3, it designed to develop a culture of safety and resilient communities. This pillar gives emphasis on the integration of DRRM in the school curriculum and in extracurricular activities and providing capacity building on DRRM for learners and personnel. So example for this are the training for teachers. So we have the objectives. Protect learners and education workers from death, injury, and harm in schools. Second one, plan for educational continuity in the face of all expected hazards and threats. Safeguard education sector investments. And the last one, strengthen risk reduction and resilience through education. So we already discussed this one, that's pillar one. That's pillar one. Example of pillar one. So we have the safe learning facilities, or the term, we have also the temporary learning space, TLS, disaster resilient classroom design. Next one, we have the pillar two. We already discussed that. And the pillar three, this is an example from the Philippines. National Framework Foundation. So we have from the Philippines, we have the Republic Act 10121, Philippine DRRM Act of 2010, Republic Act 9729, the Climate Change Act of 2009, Republic Act 10821, Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act. So we have the 10-point agenda. We are responding to the directives of our President Duterte to strengthen and enrich curricular reforms on anti-illegal drugs, reproductive health, and disaster preparedness. So, in response to the quality education, climate action, so those are examples of sustainable development goals. So, this is an example coming from the Philippines. So, we have the RA 10121, Philippine DRRM Act of 2010. It strengthens the country's DRRM system. For disaster relief and response approach to DRRM, establishment of an organization structure through national and local DRRM councils, multi-hazard, multi-sectoral, interagency, and community-based approach. So, an example of a DRRM framework based on the Philippine DRRM Act of 2010. So, we have the NASH emphasizes the need to adopt a disaster risk reduction and management approach that is holistic, comprehensive, integrated, and proactive in order to lessen the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of disasters as well as climate change. National Disaster Reduction and Management Framework. So we have four thematic area. The first thematic, disaster prevention and mitigation, avoid hazards and mitigate their impacts by reducing vulnerabilities and exposure and enhancing capacities of community. We have thematic 2, disaster preparedness. Establish and strengthen capacities of communities to anticipate, cope, and recover from the negative impacts of emergency occurrences and disaster. Thematic Area 3, Disaster Response. Provide life preservation and meet the basic subsistence needs of affected population based on acceptable standards during or immediately after a disaster. Last thematic area, disaster rehabilitation and recovery. Restore and improve facilities, livelihood and living condition, and organizational capacities of affected communities and reduce disaster risk in accordance with the Building Back Better principle. So, Republic Act 10121. So, as we said a while ago, so there are four thematic areas. So, we have the prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, and rehabilitation and recovery. Safer, adaptive, and disaster resilient Filipino communities toward sustainable development. So that is an example. Another one, example coming from the Philippines, Climate Change Act of 2009, Republic Act 9729 on basic education. So under Section 15, the Department of Education is a member of the advisory board of the Climate Change Commission. DepEd is a member of National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council and committed to implement DRRM in the basic education. DepEd is a member of the advisory board of the Climate Change Commission. Section 15 of the Climate Change Act states that DepEd shall integrate climate change in the primary and secondary education curricula or subjects. So we already discussed this one. Okay, next one. The last one for we have Republic Act 10821, Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act. Protection of children's rights before, during, and after a disaster. Comprehensive emergency program. Plan of action for prompt resumption of educational services for children. So, next one, we have the inclusive and child-centered DRM. Because of this RA 10821, we're going to discuss inclusive and child-centered DRM. Okay. What? Who is a child? All human beings under the age of 18, regardless of age, regardless of race rather, ethnicity, gender, and ability or disability. That's according to United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Children, according to the UNCRC, or the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, are those below 18 years old. This international instrument has a local counterpart legislation in our country, which is Republic Act 7610, Special Protection of Children Against Abuse, Exploitation, and Discrimination Act, which defines Filipino children as those under the age of 18 as well. So we have the inclusion. All children, small and big, girls and boys, minorities with disabilities, and special abilities. Policies and frameworks. We have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have the Biwako Millennium Framework. We have the Sendai Framework for Action. We have the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act of 2010. And we have the Republic Act 10821, Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act. Effects of disaster. Okay. Effects of disaster to an individual child. So let us see. So normal routine and relationships are disrupted. Next one, we have basic needs are not met. Next one, we have psychological disturbances. And last one, we have exposure to danger. That's the effect of disaster to an individual child. Next one, the effect of disasters to child in the family. The first one, we have helplessness of heads of families and reversal of roles. Inability of the parents to protect their child. Inability to provide proper guidance. Increase of domestic violence. Last one, we have separation due to death. Next one, we have the effects of disaster of a child in the community. Community values are changed. Inability to go to schools and other damaged facilities. Unintended loss of access to services due to sanctions on government and rebel groups. Social roles and relationships are changed. This is according to my source, UNICEF Philippines. Child-centered DRRM. We have making children front and center, nothing about us without us. There are four categories of children's rights according to UNCRC. We have survival, development, and protection, and participation. Child-centered practice must then be a promotion of these four categories of children's rights. Child-centered DRM is simply putting children at the front and center of DRM work since our main clients are children in the schools. These children are the ones DepEd as an institution intends to be safe from any harm by making them aware and prepared from any hazard. Moreover, the DRRM practices that child learn in school by active participation is transmitted to become community practices as they become adults and leaders of their own community. Children's attributes that may affect their DRR participations in school. So we have first age, next one we have gender. Age, small children are marginalized than older or bigger children. For gender, boys are more preferred for leadership positions and other opportunities for participations. Physical disability, children with disability are often disregarded due to their physical limitations. Ethnicity, indigenous children are often not factored in planning and decision making. We have UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 12. Source is the Save the Children Incorporated Philippines. So we have state parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters except affecting the child, the views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. What it says. All children are capable of freely expressing a view and therefore must be recognized and be given value. No lower age limit shall be imposed on the exercise of right to participate. And adults must create opportunities enabling environment and public policies and legislations that impact children's lives. Child participation practice standards. Practice standards are statements that describe an expected level of performance. Its primary purpose is to ensure consistent, high quality child participation practice. Our resource, Save the Children. Next one, we have the resource mobilization and partnership. Okay, let us have some definitions. We have resources. These are the inputs that are used in the activities of a program. Broadly speaking, the term encompasses natural, physical, financial, human, and social resources. We have resource mobilization is the process by which resources are solicited by the program and provided through budget allocation or by donors and partners. The process of mobilizing resources begins with the formulation of a resource mobilization strategy, which may include separate strategies for mobilizing financial and in-kind resources. Source, we have US aid. We have the steps in resource mobilization, defining strategic properties, then second step, understanding your partners or donors. Third step, doing networking, marketing, and defining resource mobilization approaches or strategies. And the last one, identifying practical systems to support resource mobilization. Let us discuss it one by one. Step one, we have defining strategic priorities. Priorities. So key result areas, risk-informed policies and standard, IEC and advocacy for resilience, partnership for strengthening resilience, resilience education, DRRM information system and research, learning continuity and resilience. Under this, the strategic priorities are the key areas where you need your resources. It is what all the resources that will be mobilized will be used for. Defining the strategic objectives is a crucial first step because it gives your potential partners or donors an idea what you need resources for and eventually decide if it is something that they can support. Plus, it helps you identify what kind of resources you will need. Second step. So we have understanding your partners or donors. Who has what, where, and with what interest. This step is a mapping of potential partners and donors, and this helps you identify which partner to approach for what kind of resources needed and how to approach them. This is the knowing your terrain step. Interest is that thing which ultimately drives a person or an organization, and this is also what they ultimately have to protect or promote. It is different from needs, as needs satisfy interest. Example, we need food because of our interest to survive. It is important to understand a partner or donor's interest because this will guide you in lobbying or negotiating for support. We approach partners, donors for support in such a way that they're supporting the program will also serve their best interests. We take some, but we give some as well. Partners or donors will always ask, what is in this for me or my organization? And the answer to this must always be something that will promote their interest. You get what you need, but you also give them what they need. Like, for example, for some local officials. Next one. So we have step three, doing marketing slash networking. Nobody would buy a product he or she does not know about. No partner or donor will provide resources for something that they do not know about. This is what marketing and networking is about. Making your product known and creating a positive image for your product. In the business parlance, this is called branding. Even social services can have brands. Implementers can make their services known and can create a positive image for the services and for the organization. Pag-asa, for example, has created a branding image called Ella the Umbrella. Plan International came up with the branding of their program known as Batang Listo for DRR, Batang Bibo for Education, Batang Lusog for Health. Those are examples in the Philippines. Next step. So we have defining resource mobilization approaches or strategies. We have financial resources, fundraising, requesting for budget allocation, grants application, technical, human, and social resources. We have partnership, standby, arrangement. So fundraising, it can be fund run, donation boxes, individual sponsorships, and so on. Or it can be a lunch or dinner for a cause, like that. Requesting for budget allocation. Budget allocation windows include budget for a specific area. Grants application involves submission of proposals to national and international donor agencies. For technical, human, and social resources, like for example, partnership, may be formal or informal with any organization that can provide the non-material resources needed. Like for example, yung first aid training, fire prevention training and inspection, logistic resources, like that. Next, standby arrangement for formal partnership with organizations who agree to loan the resources when needed. Human resources and technical experts needed during emergencies such as doctors, engineers, EIE specialists, uh, suppliers, logisticians, and so on. Next one, step 5, we have identifying practical systems to support resource mobilization. Which among the other DepEd offices do you need support from? You need resources to mobilize more and critical resources, especially in the last two steps, marketing and implementing your strategy. These resources may be available within uh, the department, but some may only be available outside the department or an organization. For example, you need communication and promotion support. You need warm bodies if you will organize events. Next one, education in emergencies or the EIE. Let me give you a question regarding that. What are the needs of children that have to be addressed during emergencies? So we have the effects of disasters on the education sector. These are the effects. So we have injury or loss of lives of personal learners, destruction of facilities and learning materials, disruption of classes and learning processes, realignment of resources from development programs to response, recovery, and rehabilitation programs, long term emotional, psychological, and economic impact on personnel. What is education in emergencies? The provision of quality education opportunities that meet the physical protection, psychosocial, developmental, and cognitive needs of people affected by emergencies, and that can be both life sustaining and life saving. Why is IE? Why is EIE important? EIE is life saving and life sustaining, or INEE. While mostly we see education as secondary to other children's needs during emergency, continuity of education and schools operation is important as providing food, shelter, clothing, and any other to children. There are several reasons why EIE is important. Let us cite some importance of EIE. It is fundamental right to all, and in emergencies, children and other learners are often denied this right. It is critical for healthy development. It can help children and youth deal with the effects of crisis situations. It can help create a sense of normalcy for children and communities. It is critical to provide protection in a safe environment and provide saving and sustaining skills and support. It can provide nutrition. It can identify and reach children with special needs. And there are also lots of importance of EIE. Minimum standards of EIE. So we have education for all, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, core humanitarian standards. So the International Network on Education in Emergency, or the INEE, was established to develop standards to promote a minimum level of access to quality education for all persons, including those affected by emergency. The standards are based on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, CRC, Education for all rather, EFA, and Humanitarian Charter to represent universal goals for helping adults and children achieve the right to life with dignity. We have the EIE technical components. So we have the response, emergency supplies and logistics, temporary learning spaces. We have teachers mobilization and training, resumption of formal education, psychosocial first aid. This is an example of EIE technical components. Next one, we have rehabilitation and recovery. We have rehabilitation of classroom and disaster risk reduction. So the humanitarian cluster approach aims to ensure a more coherent and effective response by mobilizing groups of agencies, organizations, and NGOs to respond in a strategic manner across all key sectors or areas of activity, each sector having a clearly designated lead in support of existing government coordinating structure and emergency response mechanism. The Interagency Standing Committee, or the IASC, now called the Country Team, or the HCT, introduced the humanitarian clusters approach during emergencies. Coordination is a crucial strategy used in DRRM. Effective systems of coordination mean lesser gaps and overlaps in the support given by different organizations. There are two parallel cluster system approaches that are activated during emergency. One is the HCT cluster system, which was set by the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 46/182 in 1991 and enhanced in 2005. There are 11 clusters under the IASC humanitarian cluster system, each led by a UN agency or an international NGOs. They work closely with the corresponding country authorities during emergencies. So we have next the education cluster. In the Philippines, we experienced the Yolanda. So let us have this example. Implemented and monitored in education, sector response recovery and rehabilitation program under the Yolanda Comprehensive Rehabilitation and Recovery Program, or the CRRP, activated ISC humanitarian cluster, which included the education cluster through the formal request of the Philippine government, formulated the Education Strategic Response Plan, or the SRP, based on assessment data, which became the basis for the hack appeal. The education cluster was one of the 11 clusters activated by HCT, as I have said a while ago. It was supported by the UNICEF and Save the Children as colleagues with Department of Education, providing technical coordination information management support. One national level clusters and two regional level clusters included early registration in the programming, also established an ECCD and wash in schools subclusters. These are examples. Wash in schools is deemed an important element of EIE response, as hygiene promotion is crucial during periods of emergency. The range of program covered included most of the technical components of EIE. So we have the temporary learning spaces, the rehabilitation of classrooms, construction of new classroom, rehabilitation construction of wash facilities, provision of psychosocial support, provision of teaching and learning supplies, teachers training, back to school campaigns, and other interventions. So the education cluster Yolanda experience, these are the education strategic response plan, example of a plan, preschool and school age children 3 to 17 years provided with learning materials and supplies. Target 500,000 learners. Children accessing temporary learning spaces, or the TLS. Target 5,000 TLS. Education service providers trained on at least one emergency related topic. Targets 10,000 service providers. So this is just an example coming from the Philippines. So that's all for my topic for today. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I thought that we have host, so I just wait for allow him. Oh no. Oh no. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your time and for your really learning full material which you already present. Uh, First of all, sir, this topic is completely different with me. But when I focused on something on your country act, there is something different where a country can survive or can prevent all the environmental pollution, all the things. So this can helps definitely everyone, because if your country will remain okay, then you can remain okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
sir. Thank you.
See you in the Q&A portion, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now I'm going to invite our second speaker, Sir Emmanuel D. Dumaisic. Hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, I can hear you, sir. Sir, I would like to request you, please introduce yourself.
Okay, sir. I'm Emmanuel de la Cruz Dumasig. I am a Filipino teacher who will be speaking about DRRM today. I just want to give you some details regarding my background. I am also a Navy reservist, and I am proud uh, being member of Kabalikat Civicom Association Incorporated. It is a worldwide network of responsible civic communicators whose mission is to support and dedicate Filipinos in their service, being member of several organizations that focus on safety and disaster risk reduction education. I just wanted to express my gratitude for the opportunity to speak as one of your guests, and I am ecstatic and pleased to be part of the institute, and I am hoping that the information I share with you today will be beneficial for our future teaching careers. This is just a continuation of Dr. Hakuman's topic a while ago. I hope you will learn from me and continue to learn as well. So, continuation of our topic regarding the disaster preparedness and climate change adaptation. My topic is the global, national, and local frameworks for climate change, information management, education in emergencies, continuation, and contingency planning. So let's begin. The global, national, and local frameworks for climate change are all discussed in this topic. It is critical that we stay current on the various frameworks, information for updates, and awareness. We shall find solutions to this issue as well as opinions concerning the manifestation of climate change and what climate change is as a general overview. And we shall find these ideas about principles, common but differentiated responsibilities, the principle of equity, and the climate justice. So we have legal framework, which is the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Here in the Philippines, we have the Climate Change Act of 2009 and the People's Survival Fund of 2012. So we've noticed that there are countless and ominous signs of climate change popping up all over these days. So it is everywhere. As an example of signs of climate change, so you can see the Arctic breaks, many records, and it is warming faster than any other place on Earth. Like this other one, the dismal picture of poles as sign of climate change might be seen here. Uh, we can say that this is a tragic picture. The dramatic change in Alaska's Muir Glacier can be seen in the photo. So as you can see now, now you see it, now you don't. No? So the picture explains itself. The scientific findings on Earth temperature and its rise as evidenced by the data presented herein, both globally and in our own country, especially here in the Philippines. So globally average land and ocean surface temperature increase of 0.885 degrees Celsius from 1880 to 2012. So we might identify that the climate change must defined as human-induced climate change is the warming of the climate system due to the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as a result of human activities. And this is an example diagram of greenhouse effect and the enhanced greenhouse effect. So the first one, the earth is covered by blanket of gases which allows energy from the sun to reach the earth's surface, where some of this converted to heat energy. Most of the heat is re-radiated towards space, but some is re-radiated towards the ground by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is natural effect which keep the earth's temperature as a level necessary to support life. So a diagram of the natural greenhouse effect on earth, where the earth's temperature is kept constant to support life. The other one is the human activities, particularly burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, agriculture, and land clearing, are generating more greenhouse gases. Greater concentration of greenhouse gases will trap more heat and raise Earth's surface and temperature. So the diagram shows how additional greenhouse gas trap more heat in the Earth's atmosphere and rises the temperature. Climate Science 101, it is warming. Who caused it? Who caused it? It is us causing it. We are sure it is unequivocal. It is bad. We bear the brunt of its impact, and we are vulnerable. But still, we can fix it. So what is the UNFCCC that we are talking a while ago? The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is an international treaty for the environment. It outlines how specific international protocols or agreement may be negotiated to set binding limits on greenhouse gases. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is an international environmental treaty negotiated at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, or the UNCED, informally known at the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro from the 3rd to 14th day of June in 1992. The principles of the UNFCCC, the ultimate objective of the Framework Convention is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference of the climate system. So those are the human cause or the human induced climate change. This requires that GHG concentration or the greenhouse gases are stabilized in the atmosphere at a level where ecosystem can adapt climate change, food production is not threatened, and economic development can proceed in a sustainable fashion. Another one, that parties should act to protect the climate system on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities, and that developed country parties should take the lead in addressing climate change. All parties make general commitment to address climate change through example, climate change mitigation, and adapting to the eventual impacts of the climate change. Another principle, according to UNFCC Article number 4, Section 7, states the extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitment under the convention will depend on the effective implementation by the developed countries parties of their commitments under the convention related to financial resources, and transfer of technology, and will take fully into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. So we heard a while ago that we have 187 countries participated in this UN convention. So what are the agreements at the UNFCCC? The Kyoto Protocol concluded in 1997 and established legally binding obligations for developed country to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in the period of 2008 to 2012. It had it has had two commitment periods, the first of which lasted from 2008 to 2012, and the second one runs from 2013 to 2020, and it is based on the Doha Amendment to the protocol. The 2010 Cancun Agreement states that future global warming should be limited to below 2.0 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degree Fahrenheit relative to the pre-industrial level. In 2015 Paris Agreement adopted the 2015 governing emissions reduction from 2020 on through commitment of countries in ambitious nationally determined contributions, or we call it NDCs. The key element of UNFCCC, which is the equity expressed as common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. So, adaptation to climate change, our living system's ability to adapt to climate change is largely determined by the human and natural system. In human systems, it is the process of adjustment to actual expected and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. In natural systems, it is the process of adjustment to actual climate change and its effects. Human intervention may facilitate adjustment to expected climate. So, we already heard what is the meaning of vulnerability a while ago. So, high exposure sensitivity and high potential impact but low adaptive capacity, thus high vulnerabilities. So, another example is the low exposure, low sensitivity, low potential impact, but with high adaptive capacity, the vulnerability also is low. So, if we have the high exposure, low sensitivity, low potential impact, but we have high adaptive capacity, the vulnerability also is low. But if the exposure is high, the sensitivity is high, the potential impact is high, the adaptive capacity is high, so we will have also the low vulnerability. So vulnerability increases as the magnitude of climate change or sensitivity increases. If exposure or the area, the population exposed to climate stresses increases, if adaptive capacity is decreased. So some example of assessing degree of vulnerability. So we will not discuss this further. No? So one example, for example, the exposure is more population. No? In more area exposed to climate risk, the sensitivity is high. But the adaptive capacity is low, no, and the vulnerability of the system is high degree of vulnerability. So if the exposure is less and the sensitivity is non-sensitive, but the adaptive capacity is high, still we will have the low degree of vulnerability. If the exposure is limited, sensitivity is high, the adaptive capacity is medium to high, then we will have the medium to high vulnerability. And this identifies the example of assessing degree of vulnerabilities. So linking uh, climate change action to disaster risk reduction and management. So we have the climate change adaptation. The other side, we have the disaster risk reduction and management. So let's see what are the similar and differences. We are more familiar with DRRM techniques at the moment, whereas climate change actions or adaptations are sometimes misunderstood. We must connect the two since they have similar implications for a long-term growth. For example, climate change and disaster risk. Both fields aim to reduce the vulnerability of community and achieve sustainable development. We have heard a while ago, we have different natural hazards here on Earth. We have the earthquake, we have the tsunami, flood, volcano, eruption, the storm, and other natural disaster or natural hazards rather. Disaster risk reduction and climate change actions, which is the mitigations and adaptation, they share common goals. And the significance and connection of climate change and disaster risk reductions are both fields aim to reduce the vulnerabilities of the community and achieve sustainable development. So the similarities between the climate change actions or adaptations and the disaster risk reduction, as they both aim reducing vulnerabilities, and the differences are climate change action addresses the risks from changes in climate, while DRR or disaster risk reductions, those from other natural hazards such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, and that CCA factors and how changing climate redefines the characteristics of climate risks. As the previous slides, both CCA and DRR focus ways and means to reduce risks from extreme events. Convergence is achieved if DRR increasingly factors and how climate change may influence the characteristics of these extremes. So now we were going to discuss the information management with regards to disaster risk reduction. So on onslaught of a disaster, what we are going to do, what are we going to, how are we going to manage those informations that we have right at this moment? So this is our topic on information management. Once again, this article discusses the meaning of DRRM in general. So at the end of this session, we are going to explain the importance of information management in disaster risk reduction and management. So do you agree that information saves lives? So who among you agrees that information saves lives? So let's continue. So what is information management? Information management is the systematic collection of relevant information from different sources. Its analysis and sharing or distribution to be used to make effective and timely decisions, and its storage of or archiving and eventual deletion. So effective information management for disaster is vital component of international disaster response and relief. It is based on the premise that accurate and timely information is available before, the early warning and monitoring, during, and after slot of a disaster. In the context of disasters, information management is very crucial part of DRRM. And during the response phase, it indeed saves lives. Generally, reliable information gives a picture of extent and damages of any hazard, where the damages are, and what help the people need. Sound information management also helps in quickly identifying who can provide the support needed by the affected population. So information management comprises of an entire infrastructure which involve people, processes, and technology. Of course, the first one, people involved, but are not limited to data owners, collectors, analysts, managers, users, or decision makers. Processes are the steps and protocols to follow in the different stages of information management. So we have different steps and protocols and data collection. It depends in our country where we belong. Technology makes information easier to collect, process, analyze, share, and store. It provides us tools that make information manageable. So information or data are essential elements of DRRM. Information management is a key competency that DRRM should have. This involves competency in managing and conducting data, information gathering, analysis, sharing, and storage. So why is information management important? So information management is very important to each and every one of us because number one, it aids DRRM policy making and operationalization of programs, supports policymaking, planning, and program of our department. Another one, provides critical information during the disaster, during preparedness and response stages, accurate information on number of learners or number of schools in an area helps identify by the numbers of prepositioned items needed before the hazards strikes. Accurate assessment and data resources mapping makes response effective and efficient. Having an standardized IM tool, no, like for example here in the Philippines, the Department of Education is using the radar, no, or the rapid assessment of damages report that makes the information more accurate and relevant to the different stakeholders. And having regular updates informs stakeholders what course of action to be take before and after the specific hazard. So, uh, informing our stakeholders what resources are needed, where and who could potentially provide those resources. It is a systematizes and centralizes information. And of course, using those information management, we can inform our local government, our stakeholders, our shareholders, what actions to take and who they can coordinate with. So this is what uh, I am talking a while ago. Here in the Philippines, we are using the I'm not sure if the other country is using this kind of reporting also. So we have the rapid assessment on damages report. We use this to be able to find out what are the infrastructural damages, damages in personnel, evacuation centers, school furnitures, learning materials, computer sets, whether classrooms are totally or partially damaged, could be minor or major damages. General assessment of damages is discussed in this report. Okay, damages outside the classrooms, school name, and damages appliances, computer damages, and how much is cost. This will determine during the detailed assessments which be conducted by EFD engineers and which will be the basis of programming for the classroom repair and the new construction. So this is school based. So another one, clean up and temporary learning spaces supports are determined by different criteria per the number of priority areas per hazard. Criteria for clean up support may be one or more of the following: number of infrastructural damages, number of partial minor damages, number of non-infrastructural damages, for example, the furniture, learning materials, computer sets. Temporary learning spaces supports is based on the number of totally and partially major damage in the classroom. So this is just an example of how we are going to have a quick and accurate report for our department. So exposed schools versus effective schools. So by practice, the DRRMS uses the term exposed in situation reports to determine the overall number of areas which were forecast to have the possibility of being hit by the hazard. This is usually pertain to a large area which may be in the track of tropical cyclone or those which may experience secondary effects like landslide, flooding, fire, etc. The term affected, however, is used to determine the total areas which actually have been given or have reported to have class suspensions or school use as evacuation centers. Also, only affected schools are required to submit the rapid assessment of damages report. As generally, these are one of which had disruptions in class days. The purpose of this And the purpose of this signal is to warn impending occurrence of given meteorological conditions. It must be noted also the approximate lead time to expect the range of the wind speed given for each signal is valid only when the signal number is put in effect for the first time. So in our countries, in different countries, uh, we can know the different tropical uh, typhoon signals or wind signals, no, by watching televisions, listening to radios, updating to the websites, and sometimes by the use of social medias. So Consolidation of radar is based on the affected areas during the previous hazard or disaster. So the consolidated radar is sent to these affected divisions, and then forget to have an idea on which schools are affected. Then they are tasked to validate these damages, infra and non-infrastructure from their schools and submit a vetted report which will be the basis for the computation of funds for the provision of support. So the consolidated report is also endorsed to several offices for their immediate action. So from sending reports to consolidations to feedback giving, and then after feedbacking, so we have the validation and vetting of damages, and then after that we will have the provision of support for response, early recovery, and rehabilitations of those affected schools. So what are the possible support we can get from our own education department or even from our partner agencies or stakeholders? So school cleanup funds, temporary learning spaces, textbook, computer sets and classroom furnitures, psychological first aid or psychological support, classroom repair and reconstruction. So we also need learning kits, wash kits, teachers kits and classroom furnitures. Those things were needed if our school is deeply affected by a disasters. So before the hazards, of course, we have a preparations or disaster preparedness measures for our own schools, for our own offices, for our own department. We have the pre-disaster risk assessments and advisories or the PIDRA, tracking of key officials. Of course, we are looking for some agencies that we could help us or we can help us. So we will also look if we need to have a class suspensions in our schools, and schools use as evacuation centers because in some other countries they use schools as evacuation centers, especially here in the Philippines. If there are some local government unit that they don't have evacuation centers, they borrowed schools as their evacuation center. Of course, we need to disseminate necessary advisories to the field offices and key personnel to be able for them to know what they are going to do. So we will going to implement the department orders, attempt the pre-disaster assessment. So we will identify the whereabouts of these key officials, coordinate with the local government unit, coordinate with the local authorities, gather reports, observe the laws, which is provide assistance to this area. And of course, we need to send necessary reports to concerned offices. During the hazards, so we are going to identify or we're going to track the officials. Of course, if it is school days, we need to suspend classes. So we need to use schools as evacuation centers if it is needed, the response clusters as evacuation centers, response clusters as operation centers. Sometimes we need to participate in our operation centers or field reports. Disseminate necessary advisories to the field offices in key personnel. So we're going to identify those things that we need to do during the onslaught of hazard or a disaster. And after hazards, of course, uh, we are going to track the officials, the personnels in our offices, in our schools. So we will see if the class suspensions are going to resume or this class resumptions or the school is still used as evacuation centers. So we need to find response interventions for our rehabilitations and recovery intervention. So we need to coordinate with our local government. We need to submit reports on what is happening or what happened after the onslaught of a disaster. So the basic education in emergencies, with this topic, we will have ideas that may apply in any emergency, such as pandemic that is currently occurring. So a while ago, we already heard what is all about the education in emergencies. Dr. Hakuman already discussed it. Now we will going to continue, or we will going to add something, which is we are going to identify the different education in emergencies, especially the needs of supplies and how they are different from ordinary education supplies. And we are going to discuss the concept and strategies involved in making EIE supplies timely and relevant. So after discussing this, the objectives of this topic is to discuss the coverage and limitations of this topic. This is just an introductory module on supplies and logistics for education in emergencies. This consists of some strategies in supplies and logistics which were proven effective in different emergency contexts here and in other countries. While some of the countries are not yet practice this kind of AIEs. But it is worth exploring if we can actually undertake these strategies for more efficient and responsive emergency education supplies and logistics. So some definitions: when we say supplies, that is those are goods, articles, or raw materials needed to achieve particular objectives. So in the context of EIE, the objective is to provide continuity of learning for all children the soonest possible time, and even the midst of a disaster, the rationale of which has been already explained in the EIE a while ago on why resumption of classes is very important. So, education in emergency supplies are temporary supplies or stopgap measures that are made available for all the, for example, teachers, learners, and other personnel of the affected schools by a disaster. They should be age appropriate, catering to early learners as well. This also include materials for play activities as first days of the resumption of classes. During emergencies are opportunities for children or even the teachers to feel safe and relax. So logistics pertains to transport and storage, meaning how goods or supplies can get to the intended recipients on time and conditions and quantity desired by the recipients. The utmost care should be given while goods or supplies are being transported and stored. The recipient have the right to refuse acceptance of goods or supplies which are damaged or not in their best forms. Logistic management is planning and executing as planned on how to transport and store goods and services. So the mission of logistics is to get the right goods and services to the right place at the right time in the desired condition and quantity in the relation to customers' order. So key supplies and logistics activities and decision: set standard specification of each supply item. So we're going to identify suppliers, undertaking the procurement process, identify the storage facilities of bulk stocks, and conduct regular inventory. So we are going to do this before the onslaught of a disaster. Packaging and packing: establish procedures for request and dispatch delivery, identify specific means of transport of supplies to different types of terrain. No, for example, if it is flat, mountainous, island, or narrow passages. So identifying means of transport of supply, responses during emergency periods are about saving and sustaining life. So emergency education supply should be delivered faster than the usual. Also, during emergencies, movements of goods should be well taken care as the usual routes and thoroughfares may be closed. Alternative modes of delivery or forwarding must be considered. So key education in emergency supplies, for example, for the learning materials, we need notebooks, writing materials, art and activity materials, such as colors, rulers, scissors, space, etc. Those are things that those children or learners can use during, uh, for example, evacuation, when they are in the evacuation areas. No, they need books, subject specific learning kits, for example, science kit, math kits, ADM modules, or ECE kits, or early childhood education kits. So as I said a while ago, we must meet all ages during this education in emergency. So teaching materials, notebooks and pens, chalk or markers, writing boards or materials, furnitures, teacher's table and chairs, student chairs and tables. So we need to prepare these things before the hazards or the disaster. Take note that identifying this education in emergency supplies needs is based on assessment of the impact of the hazards to our schools or offices. In some countries, EIC supplies also include winter clothes or room heater. So it depends on the country where we belong. As I mentioned earlier, EIC supplies are temporary supplies. These are supplies that teachers and learner could use while waiting for the situation to normalize. Given this provision of some supplies to learners may not be 1:1 proportion. Some could be provided for communal use of the entire class. For example, 1:40 students. Aside from the emergency teaching and learning supplies, sanitation and hygiene supplies are also an important part of education in emergency supply set. It has been widely established that waterborne diseases and epidemics are common during disasters, and when learners got afflicted, they can no longer attend school. So sanitation and hygiene promotions is one of the best strategies to combat these diseases during disasters. That's why wash in schools an important component of the EIE program. So aside from emergency teaching and learning supplies, as I said a while ago, these hygiene and sanitation supplies are needed, like such as soap, toothpaste, toothbrush, towels, water bottles, dispensers, purifying tablets or sanitary pads, and other recreation kits, bag, tarpaulins, and tents. Some strategies for timely EIE supplies. So, supplies and logistics during emergencies cannot be business as usual, as the objective is to support and sustain life. But since usual procurement processes for supplies and services really take a long time, but some strategies could be undertaken to make the process faster. For example, number one, the stockpiling. This means prepositioning of common EIE supplies as part of disaster preparedness measure. To the extent possible, stockpiling should be done as close to schools or offices as possible. Standby arrangement. These are arrangement already agreements with service providers and suppliers. This means that there is a standby contract to supply materials or transport supplies, but which will only be in effect once there is a disaster or an emergency. This also means that is the standard specifications of supplies are already defined and necessary procurement processes already undertaken. The emergency funding of supplies procurement and transport is a standby allocation for procurement of education in emergency supplies and services. One common mistake is to allocate funds only for the procurement of goods, not realizing that the transport of emergency supplies could reach sky high process during disasters. For example, one truckload of uh, supplies amounting, for example, to 100,000 traveling from one place to another place. But You cannot reach those place which is highly affected by the disasters. So we need to consider those things also. Emergency funding for supplies procurement and forwarding should be part of the annual DRRM budget of all offices, including the local government units down to the smallest part of the society. Localize and adapt materials procurement supplies is in massive emergency is a challenge. So localizing the supplies is a good alternative. So for example, the toys and equipments or the early childhood kits, for example, could be made out of materials available in the community. So we need to localize the supplies of our AIEs. So localized procurement as a centralized procurement would mean giver logistical costs, warehousing and transport forwarding. It is best the procurement of goods or supplies are localized if they are locally available. This reduces costs significantly, and locally procured goods or supplies reach the target recipient faster and better condition. Standby arrangement could be made with the local suppliers. So role of DRRM in AIE supplies and logistics, of course, providing damage assessment reports in identifying AIE supplies, coordinating with the internal and external partners in the provision of AIE supplies to affected schools, monitoring of support to affected schools. The damage assessment report is the basis for determining what is needed by the affected schools or offices when needs are identified. Resources are mobilized to provide for these needs. So, another thing that we need during the emergency or education in emergencies are the temporary learning spaces. So now again, let us focus with the ideas of the TLS. By identifying the extent of damages of a classroom based on the rapid assessment parameters. So we're going to discuss the principles and some best practices in TLS constructions. What happens during disasters? So what you can see in the picture, everybody knows that classroom might be damaged during disasters. This picture instead focuses on what happens to a child during disasters. When schools were damaged and learning was interrupted, roaming around unsafe, full of hope, uncertain about the future, anxious about what's happening around them and what lies ahead. Dreams may be shattered. Is more psycho-emotional impact of disasters to children. So, TLS are provided to schools which incurred classroom damages after a particular hazard or disaster. As aforementioned earlier, this is a stopgap measure so that classes can resume as soon as possible. So, I want to show some examples of partially damaged schools. So, TLS are provided to schools which incurred classroom damages after a particular hazard. Before any school could be allocated for funds for the TLS, schools with damaged classroom had report about the damage through rapid assessments of damages. Classroom damage assessment, but how should they make this rapid assessment given that they are not technical experts or engineers? So you can see those partially damaged classroom can further be categorized as minor damage or major damage. These pictures show minor and major damages of classrooms like rip off part of the roofings, partially damaged windows and ceilings. Repairs of this kind damage can be shouldered by the schools. So another one, this already give away as this last remaining category of damage. This classroom poor fall under the partially damaged but major damage category, while the classrooms are not for demolitions. A significant part of the classroom are damaged, and the school cannot shoulder their repair. As you can see in the picture, those are the major damages in the schools, which they can no longer use that the school for the continuous learning. So what is TLS? Temporary learning spaces. Why we say temporary? Because TLS can be used 3 to 6 months while we are waiting for uh, everybody to be normalized. So learning where education takes place after disasters, any spaces, physical space or substitute to a classroom. Each word should be taken into consideration in conceptualizing and designing that the structure is temporary. TLS as an important component of the disaster response stage, they are the first step towards designing and implementing durable and sustainable learning spaces after disasters. TLS is not a standalone structure classroom, but holistic learning environment including a set of facilities, including wash facilities, external play space, internal learning spaces, teacher or staff space, and perimeter fencing. These are arranged within a well-considered site layout and are part of the existing community. These facilities must be complemented with accurate communities, and these facilities must be complemented with accurate curriculum, training materials and learning materials, and teachers providing safe and healthy learning environment. So very basic characteristics of TLS, of course, number one, it must be safe. Now that we know TLS is, and when we have learned to come up with a rapid assessment of classroom damage, let us see what the characteristics of TLS and what should considered building them. There are three basic characteristics of TLS. Safety of learners and even of teachers should be primary considerations in building TLS. Not only the material to be used are durable and hazard-free. The location in which the TLS will be built should be carefully selected to ensure the safety. So, we can ask our local government, the engineers, the architect, so we can put TLS safely for everybody. For example, mud floors are not recommended and should be avoided. Avoiding worm infestation in the main reason to provide sealed floor. Heavy tarpaulin or concrete slabs can provide us a sealed floor. Material like hatch or straws have a high degree of flammability, placing children at risk in case of fires. TLS are implemented within camp should carefully choose the most secure and accessible space within the camp. So, number two, the child or it must be learner friendly. The TLS must be placed where children or learners feel comfortable so that effective learning could take place, and it must have the basic provision that children or learners need. And the last one is inclusive. TLS must be able to accommodate and provide safe learning environment to children and learners, boys and girls, big and small, and regardless of their physical ability or disability. Provision should be made for learners who have special needs. So we need to consider those things, whether what kind of people are we, race, age. We need to consider these things to be able to provide the temporary learning spaces for our children or learners. TLS considerations, of course, number one, site selection. Security within the emergency in general is the best to avoid location close to, number one, for example, industrial areas, military camps, large road or jurisdictions, large roads or junctions, or traffic interchanges. It is advisable to avoid steep slopes as they typically have the following increased risk. For example, landslide, erosions, problem with the road design, and the access and maintenance, as well as difficulty with the access, especially by fire protection equipment and emergency vehicles. We also avoid location adjacent to the damaged classrooms. Orientation, sighting, vegetation, trees. Consider where the sun shines the hottest and make provisions for protection. Consider direction of the wind to design for better ventilation. So basic planning and design principles, ground condition assessment, use of local building codes, for example, fire safety code, separate entrance, separate exit to a safety place, especially in combustible materials, were used in TLS construction. Safety through transparency. Entrances to latrines and grounds should be easily visible to adults, teachers. Classrooms should have enough openings to be easily visible from the outside. So outdoor space, space for play and recreation of children, which are crucial. Normalization activities for children during the periods of emergencies. Lighting, thermal comforts, and ventilation. Lighting, there should be enough lighting for children to see the blackboard. Red and white may be natural or artificial light. Up to 15 to 20% of the floor area is window area. So the drainage, external drainage channels around the TLS and particularly around entrances should be part of the site layout consideration. Connection to electricity and water should be incorporated into design and location. So we need to consider those things in building a temporary learning spaces for our learners. So I have some example here of temporary learning spaces. This example is from Madagascar. So you can see their temporary learning space provided for their learners. Another one from Sri Lanka. Those are their TLS. Another one from Myanmar. And of course, from Haiti. No? Haiti is well known, no, for what happened to them from the previous years when they were affected by the heavy disasters. And also in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we have different kinds of temporary learning spaces provided by the education department and education engineers. So another example, another example. So and another example. So those temporary learning spaces provided for the learners to be able for them to continue learning onslaught of a disaster. Report of TLS needs using the incident report. TLS needs are vetted by the higher ups. The RMS determine the final and approved TLS needs. The RMS endorses the needs to concerned offices through the activity request, and the funds for TLS are released through Subsaro once the AR has been approved by the offices. So these are the simple process in providing temporary learning spaces for our learners. And we could also uh, tap our stakeholders and we can coordinate to them for the implementation of our TLS. For the procurement, mobilization, constructions, we can tap the PTA or the Parent Teachers Associations. These are just some of the people and offices that the DRRM should work or collaborate in the planning, construction, and monitoring of temporary learning spaces. There are maybe other people or offices, but sometimes we need to try to solicit the inputs of the participation if they can think of other whom they can work with in the course of a TLS project. So how soon after the hazard should a TLS be built? So 1 month after the hazard. 1 month after the hazard, TLS must be built. How long should TLS be used? 3 to 6 months only. While we are preparing for the resumption of classes in schools. Classroom damage are classified as partial or total damage. TLS supports the resumption of classes in schools damaged by hazards and facilitates children transition to normalcy. So, for example, in the Philippine experience, how long does it takes to process TLS requests to build a TLS by the Department of Education? It takes 4 months to process and 1 week to build one TLS. And uh, another example here in the Philippines, how much does a TLS usually cost? The single unit or the single attached unit costs 85,300 and the duplex is cost 152,000. So these are examples from our country. Is a technical staff needed in TLS implementation given that these are usually made of light materials? Yes. In the beginning to ensure that the site location is safe and in monitoring that the design is complied with. So, designing TLS should be in accordance with different considerations such as locations available to materials extent and specific context of the area. So, our last topic for today is contingency planning. After those things we heard, after those things we learned from the previous topics, now let us focus on contingency planning for basic education. To discuss the different steps in contingency planning for basic education. So, what is contingency planning? So, it is good that uh, most of the people I know they already involved in contingency planning. Now, in this topic, what we are going to do is we will reinforce our knowledge and skills to be able to make our own contingency planning. Contingency plan is very important. Number one, in our home, in our offices, in our schools, and different companies or different offices really need this to be able to prepare us for the upcoming disasters. So, contingency plan is a management process that analyzes specific potential events in a state of uncertainty and establishes response arrangement in advance to enable timely, effective, and appropriate responses to such events and situation. It is one of the identified mechanism by the law in building a disaster resilient community. Emphasizes the following common points in the definition of the UNHCR, and here in the Philippines we are implementing the Republic Act 10121 or the Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act. The process of contingency planning follows a systematic series of steps that starts from assessing risks and ends with identification of goals, objectives, actions to a scenario. It is not a haphazard activity. Contingency planning, according to International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, this aims to prepare an organization to respond well to an emergency and it is potential humanitarian impact. It involves anticipating a specific hazard based on specific events or known risks at local, national, regional, or even global levels, such as earthquakes, floods, or disease outbreaks, and establishing operational procedures for response based on expected resource requirement and capacity. It is one of the identified by the, as I said a while ago, by the UNHCR or the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Potential events or expected scenario situations, uh, these are the potential events which may threaten the society signals the need to conduct contingency plan. It involves making assumptions and developing scenarios upon which planning is based. Conducted in advance. Contingency plan or contingency planning is conducted in advance. Contingency plan is conducted upon recognition of signs in the plan to develop prior in the occurrence of the disaster or emergency. So, contingency plan must be salient feature, hazard specific, flexible. We need to revisit it from time to time, updated, and preparedness plan turn into response action, which include alternative course of action to address the gaps. So, why we need contingency plan? Contingency planning is our commitment to Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the SFDRR 2015 to 2030. The Sendai Framework is the successor instrument to the Yogo Framework for Action, building the resilience of the nation communities to disasters. So, who are involved in contingency planning? Many heads are better than one. So, we need to tap different sectors, national agencies, private agencies that can contribute for the contingency planning. When do we do contingency planning? As early as now, later when we have more information, just before the event, or right after the exact damage is known. Of course, the highlight, we should start the contingency plan now. By the moment by a certain project is or event to happen. We will not wait for any disaster to happen to us. We need to prepare as early as now. Contingency planning. So we need to uh, assess the risk, identification of hazards, analysis of impacts. Of course, we need to prioritize what hazards or disasters, response capacity mapping or capacity building. We're going to identify what are the capacities of our schools or offices to be able to priority in making the contingency plan. And we are going to develop strategies, time frame, and key actors. So contingency planning must be done as early as we projected at a specific event. Contingency plan must not rely on few or selected people, but with several people, especially those required to work together in the event of emergency. So that's all for today. And thank you very much.
Hello, sir. Can anyone hear me?
Yes, sir, we hear you.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sir. So thank you so much, Sir Emmanuel, for your time, for your beautiful presentation. And actually, from the back end, I'm just observing your presentation. And sir, for I'm sorry, actually, dear learners and our speakers, for both. Today we don't have any quiz competition and Q&A, because in my country right now, from the morning we don't have any electricity, and in my laptop I have only 2% charge. So in between time I have to declare the certification process. So um, we'll move for the certification process directly. So today no more quiz competition and no more Q&A. Okay, so thank you so much for your time. Definitely we'll arrange some webinars based on these topics. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. See you again. Definitely see you again, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Dear participants, today we don't have any quiz competition and Q&A. I will directly move for the certification process, which is right on your screen right now. For today's code 1080. For today's code 1080. Those who are new, you don't need to worry about that. We have our core team member in the comment section. Just write something you need support, then they will definitely reply to you. Those who are new, this announcement for you, because today we don't have any enough time to explain all the certification process step by step. So if you feel that you need support, just write something in the comment section, then our core member, our team members will contact you and they will support you. And those rest participants who are regular, so you don't need to guide, you don't need any kinds of guideline, I hope. So this is the certification process and certification link in the comment section right now, so no problem. And I already posted several times in the certification link in the comment section. Now you can claim your certificate easily. Just you need this code 1080. With this code you can claim your certificate easily. You don't need to think about that. We have next webinar in tomorrow, that is teaching authentic assessment, teaching and learning process part 2. Authentic assessment in teaching and learning pro learning part 2. This is our upcoming webinar tomorrow. So see you all in tomorrow. Got mine, it's my second, more to come, definitely. And when I ask something in the comment section, any open suggestion for IGP, some of them write CPD. We are working on that, so no problem. And we are trying to arrange lots of webinars for free, so no problem. Thank you so much. I hope see you tomorrow at the same time with another topic, that is authentic assessment in teaching and learning. Thank you so much. See you again. Those who are new, if you feel you need support, please write in the comment section. Our team members will contact you definitely. So no problem. You don't need to think about that. And see you tomorrow. Topic authentic assessment in teaching and learning. Today there is no quiz and no Q&A because in my laptop I have only 1% charge. Sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.